this podcast will be famous for potatoes. I hate chatbots. I hate the chatbot use case. And my thesis is AI strategies don't exist. If you hear somebody talking about AI strategies, make a fist in your pocket. When I have a screwdriver and I go to a factory and ask them, what is your screwdriver strategy? It makes no sense, right? So it's like, what's your AI strategy? AI is a tool is a technology. It's a pathway to get somewhere.
Dino, thanks for coming on the podcast.
Nice to be here.
How's Berlin these days?
Well, a little bit hot. It's mixed. I mean, Germans love to talk about the weather. And residential citizens have no right to air conditioning, so I'm suffering like everybody else. But otherwise great.
Good. So obviously, I'm looking forward to this conversation. I think one of the things that's most impressive is you've been building AI, machine learning for Fortune 50s, for large companies for over a decade. And I think in the current zeitgeist, obviously AI has been everything that people are talking about for the past 2 years.
Yeah.
As an insider, as someone who's been building with it and truly understands what's going on under the hood, where does Gen AI stack up for you? Is it this, amazing innovation that's so different than the predictive models we had before, or is it just kind of another step, but now it has a lot more attention?
Yeah. So when I say this, probably many people would just turn off, but I was never a big fan of generative AI, right? So we have classification, we have regression, and generative models, so encoders, decoders, were always something very niche, especially because they always have been working half the time. And even now today, we see that stuff breaks down still at some levels of complexity.
And breakdown, meaning hallucinations or something else in mind?
Yeah, I mean, hallucinations are also interesting, right? If we like the output, it's called creative. And when we don't like it, we call it hallucination. So for me, AI or machine learning itself, these non-deterministic systems have always been more like an interface, right? And generative AI is, of course, very useful. It's the main thing I'm working with right now, but it took quite a bit of time for me, at least, to come to the, let's say, self-revelation that we actually need to take the detour through language, right? As a coder, we have code. It's very concise. We have data points, etc. It's weird that we connect our systems to something that now generates language, feeling like a step backward, to then take a step forward to maybe create insights. But in general, you probably know the Gartner hype cycle, right?
But maybe talk through the cycle for anyone who's listening who maybe isn't.
Yeah, so I mean, the Gartner hype cycle right now, generative AI is pretty much at the peak. So probably next 6 months it's going down. But the interesting thing is a hype cycle is always contextual. So for AI researchers, the hype cycle peak was in the 80s. We are now in the maturity phase. I mean, what are you talking about? And it's quite interesting. When I talk to friends, I basically say, well, imagine someone calls you on a Friday and says like, hey, we can install fiber optic cable in your house. And you say, okay, what's that? I have a phone line. And on Monday you have fiber optic cable. And it's like, wow, it's so awesome. It's great. I mean, that's amazing. I wonder what next week happens, right? Forgetting that 10 years there have been projects building fiber optic cables and so on. And basically just now you got connected and kind of get this jump start. So yeah, I mean, generative AI in general right now is a balance between fate and faith. So it makes stuff interesting and at the same time complicated. So
You make it sound very I mean, fate and faith are both
Mm,
words typically ascribed to religion or belief systems
yeah.
or something else, very, very far from programming. Maybe contrast deterministic versus non-deterministic.
Mm,
Obviously, the words are a little bit self-evident, but they have
right.
extra meaning in the AI world. So define those, and then also kind of maybe expand on how you see this non-deterministic world of going back into language to get outcomes and maybe issues with that.
Right. So a deterministic clause is 5 is greater than 2. And you can repeat this clause as many times as you want. The
It's
output
always true.
is always true, will always be the same. And this is how software has been working, and also how we rely on building maybe crappy systems, but they are crappy at scale. It's quite a weird phase diagram when we scale up things and all of a sudden they become more crappy, or we have actually like accumulation of mistakes. And this is something as at least engineers are not used to deal with, and particularly not what I experience execs, so executives, C-levels, managers, because when they spec'd out a project in the past and looked at it and it's not perfect, but it will do. Now it can be that next month or next 2 months something crazy happened, right? And it's kind of funny because when we look at enterprises or also small startups, there are always two perspectives. The engineers usually have an outside in look, meaning what technologies, programming languages, innovations are out there in the world, and how can we use those things inside our domain in our problem space. Managers, CEOs, visionaries usually do it the opposite way around, meaning, hey, what do we have here and how can we compare, compete, satisfy, and nurture needs in the world? Now, we have the weird situation that managers cannot really rely on the deterministic nature of something inside of the company. So when I bring in AI, I might create chaos that there's enough chaos outside in the world. And managers usually expect that, well, the company inside and the systems and everything is kind of predictable. That's how KPIs and everything is born. But now the world comes into the company because, I mean, yes, non-deterministic systems or entropy or chaos is something in our systems we usually don't acknowledge. But when we look at the world, like look at the stock market, frequency trading, our whole society relies on that, and nobody can explain how it works. It would be impossible to backtrack how something happened. So we have a flipping of worlds, which kind of drifts almost like in transformation systems thinking, organizational psychology, because now the engineers bring in something that is non-deterministic, and the managers now have two variables to handle: the chaos of the outside world and maybe also the chaos of the inside world.
That's a wonderful kind of explanation of the two. We've always had chaos internally in the form of humans. Humans are
Right.
maybe predictable in mass or predictable in not the extremes, but then obviously humans can be creative or vindictive or anything, right? And so that's been modeled inside of corporations and companies for a while. I know that I could have a rogue employee, or I know an employee could mess up on some task. What's the difference between having that aspect, maybe from a psychological perspective, versus now technology is also this unknown
Mm.
variable of unpredictable and non-deterministic outcomes?
Yeah, I mean, how many people? I hate chatbots. I hate the chatbot use case. I'm so sick of it, and I can maybe a little bit talk
You hate it
about
because
that.
you're bored with it, or hate it because you don't think it's a good
It's just a lazy
implementation?
approach. I mean, so when you look at an enterprise or even a startup, you have a value chain. I'm German, so let's talk about potatoes. So we love potatoes. The value chain is a farmer grows a plant on a field, then many steps happen, and in the evening, Dino can make French fries at home, right, with a deep fryer. And there are many different steps in between. Putting a chatbot at the last step telling me how to make French fries is like, ugh, right? Or at the beginning, like a chatbot on, hey, this plant is healthy, this plant is not healthy. What is really interesting is actually going a little bit further and acknowledging that value chains are kind of in the middle. If you're in the middle of a value chain, basically, let's say from warehouse or farmer to supermarket, that's where value multipliers happen. And before I pick up the question, so just giving a concrete example, I talked to a large retail chain a while back. They wanted to do a chatbot, of course, like everybody else. I said, like, hey, so you tell me you want to do an AI strategy. Yes, we're going to do an AI strategy. And my thesis is AI strategies don't exist. If you hear somebody talking about AI strategies, make a fist in your pocket and that's it. Because at the end of the day, I mean, when I have a screwdriver and I go to a factory and ask them, what is your screwdriver strategy? It makes no sense, right? So it's like, what's your AI strategy? AI is a tool is a technology. It's a pathway to get somewhere. So I asked them, like, one step up, your strategy is to be more carbon neutral, which means you want to source locally, right? So you have thousands of supermarkets all over Europe. Let's just get the potatoes from where the closest farmers are. But the bottleneck is, of course, that these small farmers that maybe have a couple tons of potatoes, they don't have SAP. You cannot click a button in your system and order a bunch of potatoes. But what you can do, which would be infeasible, is sit down with employees that call farmers regularly, use emails, etc., to procure new potatoes. And this would be a great use case for generative AI, because now the system can basically kind of chat, write emails with the farmers and ask, like, hey, do you have some potatoes left? Can you basically ship them? And when they have a problem, they can say, hey, we cannot make it next week, etc. And this intermediary system is now putting in the data into the SAP database. So basically for you, nothing changed, but all of a sudden you enabled a real strategy you had for a long time with a new tactical opportunity. So AI technology is tactics, and strategies is where you want to be in the future. So coming back to your question, it's basically right now it's a little bit faith and fate, more like this technology is so different, we need to treat it differently. But in reality, we are in the same spot of integration hell as in the past. We have done this a couple of times now with big data, cloud computing, metaverse, crypto, Web3, etc. We should kind of get beyond this step. And this is also what I'm basically doing on the job, kind of like taking out the noise. Because especially machine learning engineers and researchers love to invent new words for existing concepts. So
There's also, you told me last time we spoke, the idea of a hype cycle is when you start using a word as a noun rather than an adjective. And I think maybe just expand upon that, because it really stuck with me, and I think it's a really good framing for when to filter noise from signal.
Yeah, I mean, so the context is I'm actually also a poster. I'm not really an engineer. I studied psychology, then statistics. I'm actually the son of a psychiatrist, so I'm really not okay. But it's really interesting how things take form over time. So in this example of stuff was first a verb, then a noun, then an object. Humans love objects. It's the thing. So when the database came along, it was first data sharding and indexing. And then it was a verb. Machine learning, also verb. Or cooking. It's like you cook something. The cooking strategy. What is your cooking strategy? But the thing is, SAP does that very well. I mean, they say they have an SAP product or database. In reality, it often takes many, many years to actually build that thing for the client it's consulting at the end of the day. But whenever you can benchmark kind of every hype cycle of where did the word come from. So in this case was statistical inference, then stochastics, then machine learning, then deep learning, and now we have our glorious object, the AI, right? And now we can put attributes to it, the AI strategy, the AI impact, the AI revolution, etc. Nobody, and it makes also stuff simple, because for conversations, humans have limited cognitive capacity. We need to use heuristics, otherwise we could not live. We cannot think about breathing in and out all the time. But it also leads to cognitive shortcuts. Like an object is something you can buy. Doing machine learning is something you need to learn. And that can often lead then to frustrations, right?
And mismatches in expectations when the board bangs on the desk and says, "What's our AI strategy? We need AI." It's talking with the wrong part of speech. It's like, well, what are we actually going to do or build, not just slap AI on to something, thus being perhaps more of a hype cycle.
Yeah, but also to be fair, right? So I recently invested in AI ETFs, right? So the board or the execs, they're not stupid. They do also they also need to use the heuristics and need to be aware that their shareholders or their VCs and their limited partners, they don't have all the time in the world to understand what the hell is going on. So they are also forced by hand, even though if they want to explain everything end to end, to cut it short and use thinking gaps. The problem is, and there we come again from this outside in, inside out perspective, when this kind of takes a life on its own, that this object noun that was used to kind of address market needs and also interest, and shareholders are fascinated by AI, and it's also a great opportunity for companies, especially in Europe, that have a lot of assets that could be leveraged through those digital capabilities to address them. But the danger is then to not shift the filter again around when you take it inside of your organization, right? And this opens up very kind of fascinating situations, more in the realm of sociology, psychology, technical leadership, and also more like perspective of what do we want to do strategically for the end customer. Our strategic goal as a supermarket is to provide potatoes that have been farmed 1 mile away from here. That's a crazy goal, right? So, and now we can estimate and see what tactical pathways we have to achieve that goal. AI could play a role, different mobile apps could play a role for delivery systems, who knows, right? But this opens up also a lot more creativity and also actionability by the domain experts at those companies, the people that really know inside out the first value chain and then the perpendicular segment of life cycle. And the store manager needs to get up in the morning, check their emails, etc. They cannot deal with farmers that need to figure out what the correct address is. Yeah, and this is stuff I basically think about more like in the philosophical realm. Yeah.
Within that world, I think it's a very helpful example to kind of show you zoom out, look at what is the problem we are actually trying to solve, and then going back in and what are the tools that are the best tools to solve that. And oh, by the way, there's a brand new tool that's added to the tool belt in the past couple of years called generative AI. Maybe that plays a part, maybe it doesn't, but let's make sure we're very clear on what that problem is first, not clear on the tools and the solution without actually understanding what we're solving.
Yeah.
Say you do identify that generative AI could be part of a solution. You talked about limitations of chatbot. You talked about the really complexity of we're just bumping into integrations again. So what does a particular tactic for a company look like? How do you go about discovering, okay, well, this is where Gen AI should fit into the overall tactics. This is where the complexity comes in from integrations. What does that strategy look like if you do determine that Gen AI is the right tool for the job or part of the
tool? So interestingly, most people approach generative AI as the carte blanche. For example, let's generate documents. Let's generate this transcript we're generating here, right? Let's generate emails. But then you basically, with a very big spoon, eat all the complexities of non-deterministic systems, stuff that just breaks down after scale without having a lot of support systems around it. So I worked at Google a little bit, and what I learned there is that they take every problem and reframe it for them to a search problem. So can we search and find a pattern and then retrieve? With generative AI, the best approach, if you listener are an exec, is to not try to generate documents, but basically keep it at, can we write prompts that only return yes or no? So
can we write prompts that only return yes or no? Because therefore it will be a deterministic outcome.
Well, it's deterministic in its output, but basically you limit the complexity of prompt engineering, evaluation, etc. on how do you shift when things are yes or no. For example, you get a ton of emails from those farmers with potatoes, and you need to know in your system if they have potatoes or not, right? So there can be quite a bit of a gradient in between. And because maybe some of those farmers speak slang, or at the same time they want to promote raspberries, etc. You don't know, right? And taking the approach that the superpower of generative AI is actually pattern recognition. Reasoning is very, very, very far down the line. You can take these systems and actually combine them and still improve them without having cascading effects. So, for example, I ask the farmer, do you have still potatoes? Okay. Can you ship next week? Yes, no. Can you, do you have this kind of potato, etc.? And this makes it possible to first have a very simple and easy way of adopting AI systems without inviting all the chaos on top of it. And when it's getting more mature, you can start either combining systems or go with outside evolutions like better multi-models, etc. But basically, you're not taking the tornado directly into your office. And this is kind of what I feel when, like in practice, people go too hard, too much, create a prototype, because creating AI prototypes is beautiful. It will always output something. And there is now an implosion of AI prototypes because they are not controllable and steerable enough to actually create ROIs. And we know that these types of tactical approaches, non-deterministic systems, will help us somehow in the future, but we need to deal with the path in between. From we're an existing 100-year-old enterprise, we have old systems, we have different silos, responsibilities, etc. And then gently try to really use generative AI to heal certain aspects, like, for example, farmers don't use SAP, right? But we need still the output in a tabular format in our Excel spreadsheets because we have been working with Excel for the longest time. Let's not start to also reinvent this stuff at the same time.
That's fascinating. It also ties into the real world applications, it's kind of going from unstructured to structured data, but controlling that as much as you can to meet the integration needs into your already existing systems.
Yeah. I mean, these approaches are instruments that are very old. So, for example, the first form, like a paper form where you need to make a cross, yes, no, was written in Rome, right? So the Roman Empire used forms to do inquiries. They could have used language to talk to the people, but it makes sense to first compress, like actually autoencoder does, like a transformer does. It compresses a context and then expands it again. And what we learned from this time is language is a tricky thing. So when I say that's hot, do I mean like how the air is hot? Or hey, this new iPad I have is very awesome and sexy? That's the difference between denotative and connotative meaning in survey designs and so on. And the problem is that this not only applies to something like our common language, but also to domain knowledge and contextual knowledge in an organization. So a classic example was a while back ago when software engineers would talk about masters and slaves. Outrageous, right? But in that context back then was a heritage from those systems. And dealing with those gaps is kind of the example of, imagine you meet Albert Einstein in a bar. Smartest person on the world. Let's just assume that. You go in, he has crazy hair like he does on his pictures, but he doesn't speak English. For you, it's just another crazy guy in that bar. It has no use to you. And that's what I mean with AI as an interface struggle. Because even if I would want to build a chatbot to help people find their lost Amazon packages, whatever, the AI has a broad horizon of general knowledge. It knows that France is in Europe, that Paris is in France, but it lacks domain knowledge. It doesn't know where the logistics centers are. Are they in Paris? Are they in France? Are they in Berlin, Munich, whatever? And then the connecting bit, the contextual knowledge is, what did you do last week? Did you talk to us? You need context. What shipping provider was used? How big was the parcel? And all those informations. And you see suddenly, even when we have GPT version 50 in 20 years, and you ask it the same thing, where is my Amazon package? If we have not solved hyper integration in the way that this intelligent system speaks our language, that's German English, knows where our logistics hubs are, and is actually efficiently integrated along many steps in the value chain, there's nothing to fear about. And that's also, researchers, I talked to like Tim Scarfy from Machine Learning Street Talk a while back, like the consensus in AI research is that we're now going to stagnation for a while again, and then for 10 years we will lay new fiber optic cable to connect your house, and then people will again, wow, this week I get internet 3.0, I wonder what happens next week.
It's a wonderful kind of sobering perspective of, yes, we're all hyped up on this because we haven't really been in the industry, but it's just the same work that's been plodding along for so long. Now it's a little bit more accessible or a little bit more thought about. And the innovation is still, yes, we have GPT-4 Omni versus GPT-4, but it's still generative models and just slightly better fine-tuned, slightly better models, slightly more modalities.
Yeah, paradoxically, software has always gone the opposite way. So the first toothbrush that was invented cost like $20,000, right? It was for the rich people, some CEOs, businesses. And then over time, it got commoditized to a way where we could buy a toothbrush for like a couple cents. With consumer software, however, it's different. The team at Facebook working on the login screen, there are more people than some enterprises have for the whole tech stack. Because exposure, meaning many users to a system, since software has infinite marginal returns, means that the software becomes extremely pretty, reliable, and also feature rich. But when you look at it from like this old enterprise stance, some managers like, hey, if Instagram can do this, where kids do their Facebook reels and TikTok dances, I mean, we should be able to build such a pretty app, right? But it's not true. It's not true. And it's even more crazily not true with generative AI, because from general private citizen perspective, the overlap of general knowledge of where do I live, etc., we can put the domain and contextual knowledge of who am I and what do I want to do into the prompt. Like, I'm currently preparing for a podcast interview with Ilya, right? So give me some ideas what to talk about. And done. I can get a ton of value out of this. For enterprises, imagine what do you want to do? Like, add all the financial statements, investor reports, corporate emails, etc., to the top of this thing to finally get some value. And that leads to kind of like an estimation in research, at least, that the value add for enterprises versus consumers is 1 to 10, meaning you and me, we get 10 times more value out of ChatGPT right now than an enterprise does. And which makes the situation also interesting, because we private citizens are, of course, also working in a working context that some enterprises say, no, we don't want ChatGPT at work. But this is interesting because these people that don't have employees usually can now use tooling to bring a 10x multiplier into their work life, because each employee individually has a much easier time to just describe again, hey, I need to write some copy for some website, can you help me, this is what we do, etc. And yeah, the next 2 to 5 years will be interesting. So
I want to come back to the future in a moment, but what is event storming?
Yeah. So event storming is basically a way to codify a value chain. So when we this podcast will be famous for potatoes, but when we come back to the potato farmers, so first we have these steps, right? Seeds are planted, a plant grows, then it's harvested, then it's shipped somewhere, etc. But when we want to capture that in a system as events, right, we need to make pretty clear what information do we want to capture. So what kind of seed was used, what date was used, what farmer was what pesticides, etc., and also the transactional events of, okay, now the field was harvested, now it's in this warehouse, etc. And event storming is basically a workshop format that was invented 40 years ago to sit down basically in a room with sticky notes before design thinking came along, with farmers and the people that actually do the work, to map out what kind of events are created along the chain of making Dino happy with French fries at home. And this is it's a very tedious, it can be very exhausting, but it helps to then find events that maybe could be automated. So the process of, okay, now we need to check if a farmer has potatoes or need to contact a wholesaler, etc. You usually see like a big bulk of events, like an email needs to be sent or some SAP system, etc. And now imagine you take this block, throw it away, and it's just emails going back and forth between a farmer and an LLM. And every time you can kind of get rid of events, it immediately means you make more money, you save costs, right? You have efficiency improvements, etc. And right now, my biggest fear is that this AI hype leads people to come from the other side, meaning they want to build a chatbot and now they try to find out where to do that best. But historically, innovation happened by people really like looking end to end at something, saying like, boy, we spent a lot of time in this area. Can we do something about this? And this is where true innovation comes from. And it's also where disasters are often prevented, because a chatbot and some things you need to do, want to do for VCs, LPs, shareholders, etc., to show you are active in the segment, can often go sideways at some point, because you are way too far away from a P&L, a profit and loss, so a profit center in a company. But also, not everything needs to be a profit center. There's also something called a data P&L, meaning you create a product that's designed, that's maybe for free, but it captures data that helps you in the next step to achieve something else, right? If we would
So
do,
creating something of value for you, for your enterprise, and
yeah.
ideally you have a strategy for why you're generating that data.
Yeah, and a good example is Google, Google and Gmail. The Gmail app existed since 2012. But in 2014, they created something called Google Inbox. It was an alternative email client to Gmail. And
It was great. I used it.
I used it a lot. I mean, back then, I was even dog fooding this thing. I loved it. And the principle was simple. It was for people that want to have 0 emails in their inbox. So swiping the emails away, categorizing them, etc. Something they couldn't do in the main Gmail app, at least not. Imagine you get a push notification, all your 2,000 emails, please categorize them. They didn't charge money for it, nothing. They built it for only one reason, and that is have people that are in this user group using the app to then train a machine learning model, so collecting the data, to be able to automatically help other people categorize their emails. And this is classic example of, this is not a profit center, there's no money, but there's a data P&L, meaning we can now get the data or information, a stepping stone, to achieve something bigger. And of course, Google's graveyard is infamous, right? I was also very sad, but in 2016 or 15, they basically had enough information to converge everything. Trained machine learning models, kickstarted with that the feature in Gmail, and retired Google Inbox, right? And yeah, this is a very tactical way of thinking about something, and I also feel, especially in enterprise, because strategy, everybody is a strategic thinker. I'm not a strategist. I could not tell you if it's better to fly to the moon or to Mars, but I can definitely tell you, if you put a ladder on the ground and say, now we're one step closer to the moon or Mars, that this is wrong. And this is what tactical people are all about, craftsmanship. And this kind of got lost. And when there's hype, even less tactical people are in there, because they are even more overwhelmed, because they think about all the pathways and they need to understand the technology first, etc.
That's a very sobering perspective. And I think, again, anytime that you start with a solution and try to find a problem, that's going to cause problems. Whereas if you start with a problem and try to find solutions, and yes, we have this new tool, maybe
Yeah.
this new tool can solve something that we couldn't solve before. That's where the ROI lies.
Yeah, I mean, in startup world, people call this a solution looking for a problem. And at the end of the day, startups and enterprises are not so different. The only difference is that startups, if they're funded well, are knowledge constrained. So they are not the customer themselves. They don't know how stuff works. And the enterprises are basically propagation constraint, meaning there are silos in place. They're clear over time for efficiency reasons, people that have clear ownership over certain things. And that makes it hard to introduce something that needs to touch many things at the same time, because the weird thing is about true AI, you would have to integrate everything to get started on one use case. And that's very weird.
Circling back to the future, maybe close us out with what are you excited about over the next 2 to 5 years? What do you see happening, and where should businesses, individuals focus their attention?
So I believe that we had the Industrial Revolution, we had the Information Revolution, .com, etc., and now we have this intelligence revolution. And I think for many people, especially large enterprises, since .com and cloud computing, they tried something, built an app, it didn't work out, and they kind of manifested this learned helplessness. Like, even though they did it 10 or 15 years ago, say, we tried this before, it didn't work. I have the feeling and the hope that AI, because it's so alien and so new, that it kind of resets the stakes. So enterprises, companies that maybe have not excelled really well in the 2010s, going into the 2020s, now they have the chance to completely start at a new race without having many deficits of also finishing in the top percentile. And everything will hinge on the aspect I mentioned, that even GPT-50 will need a lot of integration into a system. So that means a little bit more lateral thinking, and also kind of being more aware what your digital representation of your value chain and activities are. Because as soon you have that, you can basically surf a wave of technological innovations of GPT-50, Llama 16, whatever, because this is all you need. This is all you need to get then automation into place. And for many years, that was an effort kind of reserved to banking and finance, etc., because when an event goes wrong, it costs a lot of money. But now I think the real long tail economy, or people with many assets, right? Enterprises with a lot of assets can tap into that, because there's a real ROI behind it. But it is not the chatbot. And so,
Dino, this has been a phenomenal conversation. Thank you so much for coming on. If people want to connect with you, learn more about you, where should they go?
find me on LinkedIn. Also, I have a website that is kind of bare, but it's din.oo. So Dino, basically. Yeah, just ping me. Thank you for having me.
Thanks for coming on. Links will be in the show notes.